This is a program collaboration between Lead Integrity and the Temple of Understanding, a 65-year-old interfaith organization. I'm Allison Van Dyke. I'm the executive director of the Temple of Understanding. I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge the Temple of Understanding's office, which is at the Church Center at the United Nations, to honor the traditional territory of the Lenape people who were violently displaced 400 years ago. And they remain closely connected to this land. And I just would like to take a minute to honor them with a moment of silence, please. Thank you so much. So since this is the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Conference 1995, I was asked to reflect a little bit on one of my experiences at Beijing. I was there with Sister Joan Kirby, who at that time was our UN representative. I was a board member, an NGO, and we were traveling with a group of women called Women of Vision that had been started by an absolutely amazing, wonderful woman, Rama Vernon. And every morning we would get into a bus in Beijing. We would go a couple of hours to Wairau and we would have morning sessions. And then in the afternoon, we went to something that we called the Peace Tent, was where all the women in our group gathered. We had tables and all of our materials there and whatnot. So our mornings spent in these large halls hearing about the horrific stories from women all over the world, women who've been victims of all kinds of violence, everything from domestic to gang violence to the comfort women from Korea and the Philippines and elsewhere who were abused by a sanctioned system of sexual slavery, which unfortunately still exists today. All I can say about all of that is that I'm sure everyone who had to sit there day after day had the same experience of almost trauma listening to these women. It was so difficult to take in. I'm not the only one, I'm sure, who had, pretty severe nightmares. So my story is that in the afternoons, the Peace Tent was really quiet, pretty peaceful. And we also had little workshops and stuff like that going on. Well, one afternoon, we heard this horrendous noise, screaming and crying and yelling outside of our tent. And of course, we had no idea what could be happening. Oh, we looked at the opening of the tent, and coming at us was just a whole maybe 20, 25 Tibetan women screaming, crying, running for their lives, literally. And the most amazing thing happened. Every woman in that tent just created a circle and held hands and let the Tibetan women in, closed the circle, so that those men who were chasing them, who were in plain clothes, but they were probably Chinese police of some sort, couldn't do anything. They couldn't stop. They literally were carrying sticks and screaming at these women. And what happened in that moment was just transformative. That's the best thing I can say. It was a feeling of women just knowing what to do, bringing this power forth, all intuitively. Nobody even said anything. We were just there. We were just holding these Tibetan women, protecting them and caring for them. So my hope is that we can carry that spirit forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Allison. And thank you to all our distinguished participants on this, actually what turned out to be a lovely spring day here in New York. But we know that we are being joined by partners, colleagues, activists from all around. we have a very distinguished group of people who are coming together to share respective wisdom. As you heard from Alison's story, there are many aspects to women's lives, and to the way that women will organize and protect or stand on the sidelines and observe. We all react differently, just like men do. We have an opportunity, we have a moment in which each one of us is being tested on a personal level, on a public level, on a political level, on a social and cultural level in ways we perhaps did not and may not have anticipated. It is not something happening in only one part of the world. There are things happening in almost every corner of the world that test our resilience, our patience, our ability, more than anything, to stand in solidarity with one another and to form those protective, dare I say, healing circles around one another. What we are confronted with in terms of systems of oppression that seem to have come together and generated a particularly challenging set of discourses is something that also is an opportunity. While some of us can see this as moments of darkness, many of us also need to see it as moments of opportunity, to stand for what we believe in, but to stand in solidarity with one another, a word that we rarely hear. We see that many women have achieved public prominence with a lot of hard work, with a lot of grit. Here is an opportunity to see not only what they can do and what they have achieved, but also to watch and feel collectively the backlash. Toxic masculinity is not something in books. It's not research projects. It's a reality. But something else too. Toxic masculinity is not only exercised by men. Toxic masculinity's characteristics can be adopted, leveraged by women too. We are therefore confronted with our own otherness within our own souls, our own spirits, our own communities. How do we exemplify that which we deem to be necessary and important in terms of aspects of leadership? There are many forms of violence. The speakers gathered here today will speak to their unique experiences. We're not here to change the world in this particular moment. What we are here to do is to share a very rare, priceless gem. It's called wisdom. And it is wisdom inspired by experience, by hard work, by plenty of years of learning, coming from standing in solidarity with one another. Sometimes, if not most times, when that absolute determination to stand in solidarity itself is deeply contested. Yet, each of the women who will be speaking here today continue to do this. They persevere in the insistence and the determination to stand in solidarity with one another in service to all. We're deeply privileged to have with us today a number of these women, powerful by virtue of their word, their experiences, their shared struggles, and their faith, whatever it is that inspires them. We're not talking about specific religious faiths. We're talking about faith. And many of us have different faiths and they come from different sources. But to be inspired by faith, we believe, is a very powerful aspect of our identities. Not because religions are the answer to all our ills, not because religions are all good, but precisely because the way that different faiths are being manipulated today makes it necessary for us to stand as voices of women inspired by faith in service to all believers who believe in any faith and all faiths. This is what we are committed to. This is what distinguishes the Temple of Understanding and its 65 years of service to be founded by a woman. 65 years ago, when they had an opportunity, nobody knew. This is the first interfaith, international women-led organization. We hear about a lot of interfaith organizations today. Today is the heyday of religion and faith-based and interfaith. And yet we hear very little of the Temple of Understanding, created, generated, and sustained by the leadership of remarkable women. You heard from Alison. You will hear later from Grove Harris. We are all members of the Temple of Understanding, given our experience, given our wisdom, given what we believe in and what we are committed to. We are committed to understanding one another, in service to one another. Lead integrity was brought together precisely because we needed to find that space that could harvest the continued insistence and determination on standing in solidarity, inspired by the multitude of faiths, from indigenous to the most segmented and institutionalized. Women are inspired, men are inspired by faith. Lead integrity is the first women of faith led organization. We're not women centric, but we're women of faith led. And we believe that to be women centric is to be human centric. So here we are today. We're delighted to have an opportunity to have some amazing women with us to share their wisdom in discussing an issue of where it is that violence impacts on women in political spaces. And since the feminist movement has long since shared one aspect of wisdom that remains absolutely eternal, which is that the political is personal and the personal is political, we understand that violence in political spaces is not just out there, it is the here and now where we are based, and it could be within our own homes. Being able to look at this violence and understand how it happens, being able to also see how it is that we have to stand, what does it require for us? I will say no more because we have way too many competent, wise people. I do want to share the apologies of Reverend Mark Fowler, who could not join us today because he has to attend a funeral. Life is like that. There are moments where we have to stand in solidarity in the toughest of times to say farewell to those we love and admire and respect. So we wish him well. We wish that particular moment of togetherness to bid a departing colleague well. We wish that peace. And we stand together as we did a second ago to just share the moment of solidarity with him and many others who are having to stand on the side to say farewell to those they love and those they didn't love and they saw them killed in the most gruesome ways. We stand in solidarity with all those who feel the pain. And we have, on a brighter note, an opportunity to hear from one of the most powerful voices in the UN system. She's probably going to kill me afterwards for saying that, but it is a truth, and truths need to be acknowledged. She's a woman of tremendous valor, determination, courage, and above all, the warmest of hearts and the clearest of visions about what it is that women and girls need to do, because she's experienced it, she's lived it, she's served it, and she continues to stand up for it. I'm speaking about none other than Lopa Banerjee. She has an incredibly illustrious bio that is out there for the sharing. You'll find it on the website of the Temple of Understanding. But I want to speak to introduce Lopa, the woman, the activist, the one who has carried so much on her shoulders, and the one who continues to serve selflessly millions of women around the world through her competence and above all through her eloquence and incredible voice. And if you think I'm kidding, Lopa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Azza, for those very kind words. And, you know, I do not deserve them, but thank you very much. And it is so wonderful to be in this gathering with so many people, friends, people I haven't seen in a very long time. My heart is filled. I have always thought about the fact that the Temple of Understanding is such a beautiful name, and the concept itself is such a lovely but also powerful concept, and at its core, an affirming concept of our common and shared humanity. It is wonderful to be here, as I always, with you, and of course with Audrey, with Simone, with Alison, with Grove, with Dionne. Wonderful to be here. I had the privilege of being with Dionne at the start of CSW. It's something that I have been doing, I think, for more than a decade, Dionne. It's my address at the Ecumenical Forum always is my inauguration of my CSW calendar every year, and it has been that way for more than a decade. And I carry that spirit with me, Dionne, that you create in that space for the rest of the CSW. And I'm deeply grateful to you, Grove, Alison, Azza, for inviting me here. We are in the second week of CSW, but this CSW has been extraordinary. It is taking place at an extraordinary moment in our collective history. And the energy, the participation, the presence, usually when we come to the second week of CSW, the energy starts to become a little more gentle than the first week when it is intense. But this week, the second week continues to be intense. And for me, I look at this as the commitment of the thousands and thousands. We have 10,000 people here this time, about 6,000 civil society and 4,000 member states. And so I see this as the collective commitment at this time to the work that we are doing. I want to start, you placed some questions for me to address, to look at some questions when you invited me to speak, and one of the framing questions that you shared was, what do I see as the highlights of my professional experience of violence against women in political spaces. And so let me actually start with that. And I want to start by saying that we are in a world today that is more committed to ending violence against women and girls than we were in 1995 when the Beijing Platform for Action was adopted. Decades of feminist mobilizing over the years, starting from the First World Conference in Mexico, first UN World Conference on Women in Mexico, going through all of the UN conferences that took place leading up to 1995, and then subsequently, decades upon decades of feminist mobilizing have led us to this moment when some 88% of countries across the world have passed laws and established services to end violence against women and girls, which includes violence against women running for office or in political office or in leadership positions in public spaces. In addition to that, we have more than 1,531 laws on the books since 1995, when the Beijing Platform for Action was adopted, that promote gender equality. And this comprehensiveness of these laws, also together with the specific laws on ending gender-based violence, also address insecurity for women in political office. That said, even with all of this, women at this point in time still have less than the legal rights of men. Women still have only 64% of the legal rights of men, in spite of all of these laws on the books. And this leads to what we see in terms of violence against women in political office. I think it's also important to look at the fact that if you look at overall representation, the proportion of women in parliaments has more than doubled since 1995 and the adoption of the Platform for Action. And yet today, 3 out of 4 parliamentarians are men. So this complexity that we see leads to this overall situation of a global pandemic of violence against women. So we are at a moment when in 2024, 1 in 3 women, and that in other words, 736 million women are subject to physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner or a non-partner. Every 10 minutes, a woman is murdered by someone in her own family. And so women in politics face violence as women in the private sphere and as women in the public sphere who are running for office and challenging the patriarchal power hegemony of men. And I want to say this because I think it is such an important aspect to consider. We have to look at this in the context of the overall trends in the world today. Authoritarianism, de-democratization, impunity for violence, and global fragility. Overall, the world is more violent, less democratic, and more fragile than it was in 1995, when the world was coming out of colonialism, apartheid had ended, the Cold War had ended. It was a moment of hope and aspiration in 1995, when the Beijing Platform was adopted and put at its center women's representation, ending violence, security for women in the public space. But the world today faces insecurity, crises, and democratic decay. And together, they have created a perfect storm of backlash against women's rights. UN Women's Report that we released on the 6th of March that looks at this state of play. We call it Women's Rights in Review 30 years after Beijing, says that 1 in 4 countries across the world report backlash against women's rights. Nearly 3/4 of the world's population are living under autocratic rule that curtails rights and freedoms, and over 600 million women and girls are living in conflict-affected countries. So all of this, war, geopolitical tensions, economic uncertainty, political instability, create the conditions that escalate violence in the environment, including violence against women in political spaces. And ultimately, violence against women in politics is about men bringing the full weight of institutions, capital, public opinion to push back against women's right to share and exercise their equal voice, choice, and agency in society. And so if we are to be looking at, you asked me also in terms of recommendations, 1 to 3 recommendations to either governments or to the interfaith and secular civil society organizations to address this. The recommendations are fundamentally about what the faith community and all of you do so well, and that is to address cultures, to address human values, because what we need is, from a practical space, what we need is a shift in thinking towards inclusive decision-making, embedding parity as a permanent feature of power sharing, democracy, and good governance. However, that is undergirded by the need to address social norms and gender stereotypes that support and promote women's leadership and power as not just about women's rights, but about the equality, justice, and plurality of a society with all of its participants. And finally, in terms of, what is required now? What is required now is something you said earlier, Azza. It is the urgency of addressing solidarity strategies. We know absolutely that it is women, it is solidarity across groups, constituencies, various actors at local level, at community level, working on not just the idea of women's rights, but the idea of gender equality, which is the deepest, longest, most expansive quest for the equality of all members of a society and a community. And therefore, the urgency of addressing violence against women in political spaces as a key marker of advancing gender equality and building resilient, inclusive societies that are anchored in human rights, justice, and equality. Thank you. Azza, you're on mute.
Thank you very much indeed, Lopa. I was too taken by what you said in the moment to unmute myself. So thank you very much for that. And a lot of wisdom there. And thank you also for the statistics, the evidence-based facts on what's going on. I think that's equally important for all to know when we discuss some of these issues relevant to girls' and women's rights. Very, very grateful to you for the way forward, the importance of the solidarity across differences, which makes it even more difficult to do. It's easy to stand in alignment with one another when we are in agreement with one another. It is incredibly challenging to do so when we see things very differently and we come from very, very different positions. Thank you for the wisdom shared, dear Lopa. I would push back just a little teensy weensy bit on the fact that it's standing together for gender equality. I think it's standing together for human rights of all, at all times, on all rights. And I think that that is the tipping point. I do want to hear from another tremendous source of wisdom. Again, this person has an illustrious history, is much awarded, much recognized. Audrey Kitagawa, my personal mentor, someone who took me under her wing many, many years ago when I first emigrated to the United States and taught me a great deal and continues to. She is a woman of, again, another woman of tremendous valor and courage. She has no problem standing up when things are difficult, to speak truth to all sorts of power, and also to share wisdom with many communities around the world, and to serve in times of distress. Audrey Kitagawa and her community of believers are always on the ground, serving many without a moment's hesitation, and often at great cost to herself and her community members. Her formal bio is being shared right now. I just want to say we're also very privileged to have you with us, Audrey. And I know that it's an incredible gift that you gift us by being here today when you have laryngitis and you can barely speak. So I want to say a million thanks. May you feel the healing honey be absorbed as you kindly share with us in spite of the soreness that you are experiencing. And everyone get ready to listen to Audrey as lovingly as possible and send her loving thoughts as she speaks, because this is coming at a difficult energy for her. Audrey, please.
Thank you so much, Azza. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'll try to speak louder and hopefully my voice will come out. But thank you so much for this invitation to join this very distinguished group and to discuss the really important issue of religious leadership towards ending violence against women, and in particular, how discrimination and violence manifests in political contexts, and why and how faith-based organizations must proactively engage in solutions to these persistent, ongoing discriminatory practices and the culture and system that perpetuates them. In 2023, when a female member of the House of Representatives in the US was accosted with abusive, obscene language by a male member, she correctly described it as a culture of accepting violence and violent language against women and an entire structure of power that supports that. In today's polarized political climate, violent and abusive behavior is all too common. Civility, respect, and dignity seems to have fallen by the wayside. Age-old patriarchal structures and discriminatory attitudes permeate our institutions, and dismantling them is a task that will require all of our dedicated efforts. I've heard Azza share in many different forums about our need to come out of our silos. And indeed, that is so important to do, that we must come together and find a coherent way to align ourselves with this important issue. Because gender-based violence is used to maintain the status quo of gender inequalities within societies and institutions. The attitudes and values of the institutions themselves must be reviewed and challenged in order to effect change. As Lopa shared, patriarchy is rising in what some are calling a manosphere that promotes masculinity, misogyny, and opposition to feminism. It has been associated with online harassment, the glorification of violence against women, and mass shootings. And this upsurge in toxic masculinity is actually evidence that patriarchy is a mental construct that can be dismantled or changed. It is not inherent or biological. And faced with so many distorted messages, men must be extra discerning, adopt personal codes of ethics and morals. Or like Lopa indicated, we must have values. We must have a moral compass. And we must ultimately be able to follow our conscience. Because as people of faith, that divine voice that guides us all the time comes in the form of our conscience. And we know when in our behavior we've crossed the line, even though we may try to create all kinds of mental reasons and justifications for our behavior. So it is very important that we must face the many distorted messages and be extra discerning. And we must be able to develop emotional intelligence that can help men as well as women navigate the propaganda. Women's rights are human rights, and true equity can only be realized when this is acknowledged and supported by everyone. Men and boys must also take responsibility for change, become engaged as gender advocates, and examine the power dynamics in their own thoughts, speech, and actions, and within the culture in which they were raised, within the society in which they were raised, and in any culture, any community in which the degradation of any one person, a group of persons, by gender, by race, something that we must pay attention to and fight against, because it is wrong to ever crush the dignity of anyone. And I wanted to share in the political spaces, in my own personal experiences, I want to share about 2 trips that I took to 2 countries. And the first trip, I was in a political context because it was a political campaign. It was in an African country. And it was like we were the steering committee. And I wanted to inquire, how were women treated in the family? And I was told by the men, oh, we have to beat our wives. If we don't beat our wives, they don't think we love them. I was so stunned. I couldn't believe my ears. I said, is that so? He said, yes, that's part of their culture, to beat their wives. It is their way of showing love, but they said it is the woman's way of feeling loved by us. And I thought, oh, that's a really fine way to abdicate responsibility for your own personal conduct and project that onto the victim. So, these are all true stories, and I want to share another true story. And it goes about the horrible, horrible conditions. I was traveling through another country, and so many women gathered because they wanted to tell me their troubles. And they said, the rebel soldiers come and they rape us. The government soldiers come and they rape us. Everybody rapes us. And what do you folks do? You folks come, you listen to our stories. And they had affidavits, very explicit affidavits. They handed over their affidavits and they said, but all you folks do is go back and write reports. And so what? Where is our justice? They don't see the justice. And that was very insightful because there were no mechanisms for the administration of justice on the ground for these women. They were poor, they were marginalized. I saw 8-year-old prostitutes and older prostitutes. And one of the older prostitutes told me, this is my dinner. She had an old pot over burning firewood. And she said, this is grass. This is all I have to eat. And the 8-year-old prostitute, there was a firm belief that in order to avoid getting HIV/AIDS, you had to be with young girls. And it was so very sad to see. And later on, I went to Thailand and I happened to be in a jewelry store. And the sales clerk there told me, oh, the president's wife of this country that I just visited, with all of these poor women who had to prostitute themselves for food, who had no food, who had been so brutalized. The sales lady told me she spent $250,000 in cash in my store. She was so proud to declare that. And it was so sad to see that poverty, that violence, especially violence against women, are political issues, political situations. And so violence in political contexts is something that we see more and more today in our political landscape. And we are watching our democratic infrastructures, our human rights agendas falling by the wayside to authoritarianism and the bypassing of legal processes. These are very, very dangerous signs. And all the more, we must work very, very hard to stop this kind of damage and disintegration of what we have worked so hard for many, many years. Democracy, human rights, and free speech. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, dearest Audrey. And thank you for highlighting how tenuous the state of democracy and human rights, which are intimately interlinked. You do not have democracy without human rights. You can't have human rights without democracy. Thank you for highlighting how that is the general fabric, and for highlighting how important justice and the rule of law remains and is. And that further nuances some of our deepest challenges today, because we are seeing that the rule of law is increasingly another threatened species. And one wonders, if we have no rule of law, where does that leave the struggle for human rights, including the struggle for women, girls, and gender justice? Thank you very much indeed, dearest Audrey. As always, we are bidding farewell to our Lopa Banerjee, who needs to go back to the trenches of the Commission on the Status of Women and the discussions taking place there, which are of remarkable importance for all of us, because the agreed documents tend to define the role of, especially, but not only, of the United Nations to continue to secure democracy and human rights for all for the next year at least. And so, Lopa, we wish you strength. We wish you and your colleagues and all those who work alongside you continued determination, strength, and above all, compassion in what you are pursuing. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. And as we transition now to another wondrous source of valor, commitment, dedication, and absolute service to all, because this person, this Reverend Dionne Boissiere, is always there whenever she is needed to help heal, build bridges, make sure there are shoulders to cry on, but also shared wisdom that absolutely galvanizes, mobilizes, gets us all off our seats and ready, willing, and able to go. There is never a difficult situation around the United Nations engagement that Reverend Dionne Boissiere is not very much taking charge and healing. That is the Reverend Dionne Boissiere, whom we are delighted to be able to have with us here today. A note on the Church Center of the United Nations, because we heard mention of it, and many, if not all people, usually know it. But a note on that Church Center, because it also clarifies one of the many remarkable backgrounds to Reverend Boissiere. The Church Center of the United Nations was built by Methodist women for all the non-governmental actors who were working with the UN, not inside, not as staff members, but working as advocates with the United Nations system. And what the Methodist women realized is that so many of these non-governmental organizations had no place to be. The United Nations has that big, lovely building that everybody sees on TV every now and then, but it also has many other spaces for the UN system's 60 plus different entities. But the NGOs had nowhere to be. Their offices were dispersed all over the city, if they had them. So this space was built, and it was called the Church Center of the United Nations. And it has a beautiful chapel, very inclusive, very peaceful, very well-designed chapel at its base, in the basement of it, on the ground floor. It was built by religious women, Methodist women, to accommodate and provide a space for all non-governmental organizations serving alongside the civil societies, serving the United Nations and alongside the United Nations system. It is a very important space for so many non-governmental organizations, and the chaplain of this incredibly important convening, mediating, healing, bridging space and functional space is Reverend Dionne Boissiere. So, Reverend Dionne, we are delighted to have you with us here today. Please share your wisdom.
You are a gift to me. I want to first say, before I begin, for those who may be joining us, that's I will sometimes whisper, for in the whisper there is a no stammer. So I pray, and like you today, dear Audrey, my voice might be low, but I pray as powerful as all of you. So to you, the Azza who has mentored me coming into these spaces, Grove and Allison for the insight and the true gift that you bring with the Temple of Understanding. And of course to you, Audrey, who you are a light to so many of us. And truly, your grace really blesses us. And to you, Simone, for being the tech angel that we need in these spaces now. I want to first say, you mentioned about political, the violence that we are seeing in political spaces. And one of the things you often remind us of, Azza, is that the personal is political and political is personal. And one of the things that was so interesting to me was to look up what it defines politics. And it's sort of the activities and associated with governance of a small country or other area. And it says that especially the debate or conflict among individuals or parties or having or hoping to achieve power. So this sort of notion about governments and or other areas trying to conflate and achieve power. And so I thought about the kinds of power that we have or do not have, the kinds of power that we need when we're talking about speaking truth to power. But I feel like we also not only speaking truth to power, but speaking power to the truth tellers. And that is where the storytelling comes in. Just as you started, the dearest Audrey, when you told us about those stories. For me, when we as faith actors and those who are engaging in faith-inspired activism, it is our stories that have power. And it is the issue of who is telling the story and who is narrating the story. When we're talking about religious leadership towards ending violence against women, it is imperative that we take back the narrative to our own stories. There is, I preached a sermon some time ago about 5 young girls. They are called the daughters of Zelophehad. And these daughters are found, their story is found in the First Testament in biblical narrative. And these daughters came forward, right? So their father passed away, and it is the text tells us that they stood before Moses and Eleazar, the priests, the leaders, right, who were all men. And they stood at the entrance, the doorway of the tent of meeting, and they declared that though their father had died, that it was right for them to be the ones who would possess the land. Just because they were daughters, of course, the rights were not given to them. But they declared that it is right that they were to possess the land. And of course, at the end, the story says that Moses heard from God and said that their story was right. I wanted to share with you this story, this gentleman who shared a story with me, with us. It was one year in CSW, and he came and gathered around, and we were talking about these daughters of Zelophehad. And before I could do any preaching or anything, he came to us. And so he said to me, Pastor, may I say a word? And now I was a little nervous because whenever a man, he was one of the only men in the room, and whenever there's a man that stands up in the midst of a gathering of women and says that he wants to tell us something, I was a little nervous. But I yielded and listened to him. And what he said was, in his country, it is said that when the women gather in worship, that God is there. So I felt a little better for him coming and sharing. But what he got up and shared became a part of a very important story. And he shared about this story of a young couple, he said, in the village back in India where he was from. He said that this couple were arranged in marriage, and it was customary that in Indian cultural tradition, on their wedding night, they were not to see each other before then. And so on their wedding night, the young woman was there and talking with her husband. There was a knock on the door, and but she did not want to open. They were sitting there and talking, and she said that she wanted it just to be the two of them, to spend time on their first night together. But as the night progressed, the knocks kept coming at the door. And our brother who was telling the story, he says finally the new bride came and she answered the door. And she said to her groom, "Let me go and open the door." She was concerned because her mother had died and her father was elderly and sick. So it was her father, and then he was in need of help because his condition was becoming worse. And so she opened the door, and a few years later, that same couple had children of their own, and they had sons, and they finally had a girl. And when the couple had that girl, they threw a huge feast in celebration in the village. And one of their friends of the proud father, who was hosting this huge celebration for his daughter, he asked the father, "Why do you celebrate having a daughter?" This was not customary in their tradition. And usually, he said, "We honor having the sons, not daughters." And the man replied, "I am honored to have my sons. I'm proud of them. But do you know why I celebrate having my daughter?" And he replied, the friend said, "No, I don't. I don't understand." And the proud father said, "It is because I know that when I am old, she will open the door for me." You see, he remembered on his wedding night that his young bride opened the door for her father, who was in need and had cared for him. He trusted that his daughter would do the same. And then our Indian friend, who was there in the chapel and told us the story, ended by saying, "Women will be the ones who will open the doors that will lead to a better tomorrow." And I want to say that I agree. It is the mothers, the daughters, the sisters, these are the ones, in spite of the cost and the care for humanity and the condition of the world, that these were the ones who will make and lead us to a better tomorrow. But of course, my womanist sensibilities came in, and sometimes me being the Christian activist, sort of holy disruptor preacher, sometimes that I am, hearing the story heightened my womanist sensibilities. And I had to ask the questions, are daughters only good for opening the doors for others? especially the men in our society? Are we daughters to always be to be subjected to the cloak of invisibility that covers us so often under the sin of patriarchy and hetero male norm dominated norms? Or are our futures always to rest in the balance between misogyny and sexism and misrepresentation? Are we always to internalize institutional betrayal and wearing it as some sort of badge of armor while remaining loyal to institutions, church included, that threaten or leech off of our soul thriving? Especially for the sake of respectability or traditions that preserve these kind of same hegemonic evils that seek to slaughter us. I had to ask these questions. And of course, these are what lead to violence. And for me, our faith has nothing to do with the recklessness of humanity. It is our faith and the faith of these 5 girls that made them come forward and to say that we are going to shift the norms and we are going to disrupt what is status quo, so that we can be seen as equals. These 5 daughters in the text, they did the 3 things, and I will end on this so that we can have some time to talk. But they came forward together. The 5 daughters, in the midst of all that was going on, in the midst of history and a culture that said that they are to be silent, that they are not to be seen, that their stories did not matter. They came forward together. And the second is they came forward not complaining, but they came forward with solutions. Stating solutions and not spouting problems. Being prophetic is not just about naming the ills and the structural evils, but bringing solutions and ways in which we are to go forward. Not rehearsing the problems, but to get to the solutions together. The systemic oppressions and the unchecked misogyny that's everywhere, and shift the atmosphere. And then the third and final thing is that despite the wilderness that they were born into, and in spite of the cost, they had the courage to overcome the limitations and the hindrances that were presented before them. And they came forward. And so I want to say that sickness and disease, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, dysfunction, and the kinds of violence that we can see and the ones that we cannot. This is not to be our legacy. This is not our inheritance. And the sacred worth of the humanity of women and girls is imperative. And it is up to us to tell the stories, to shift the narrative, and yes, even to open the doors that's going to lead to a more just future for all.
Brilliant. And thank you very, very much for the resilience of your wisdom and for being able to enlighten so beautifully. Like Audrey, in the same way that your voice is a struggle to share, yet you share with power. Perhaps that is also it. Resilience and power you often come from a space of tremendous struggle. And thank you for giving us that very delight to begin to understand and to see how it is that we shift paradigms in service, often by standing in opposition to long and deep-rooted customs, sometimes within the systems, but sometimes within the air, which brings us to the second part of our conversation. The segue here that so beautifully was set forth by the 4 speakers is that violence against women in political spaces is also part of the violence that we exert as humans vis-a-vis one another, but also vis-a-vis the planet that we are so very much part of and completely dependent on. And it behooves us to be aware of the fact that as Audrey highlighted, we often tend to work in our respective silos. This is about poverty. This is about biodiversity. This is about other aspects of environment. This is about politics. This is about whatever. And yet the truth is that it is us as humans who interact and live in the midst of it all. And everything we do needs to be connected to various forms of oppression. You have each pointed out the intersection, the interdependence of discriminatory attitudes on one another. It is highly unlikely to meet someone who is racist, but who will be a very big advocate for women's rights in different settings. It is highly unlikely to meet someone who is completely oblivious to the damage that we exert on our environment, but who will be a great anti-racism activist. It is not the case. In fact, it is much more the case that those of us who are discriminating against one thing can also be very discriminating against everything. And that reality is where what brings us to be able to understand, as our next two speakers will help enlighten and show from their own experiences, how it is that our very planetary existence can be violated, but also saved by the way in which we look and serve the spaces where women and men serve politics and the decision making. In that regard, I am very delighted to be able to introduce, not really, but just share. We have Simone Senogles with us here today. And she's an environmental, she comes from the Indigenous Environmental Network. You heard in the beginning, Alison acknowledge this land we stand on, to whom it belongs, and how violently they were pushed out of it. Indigenous people's rights are not a silo, even though they are often practiced as though they are. Indigenous people's rights are the fundamental human rights of all. Indigenous people's rights are about the planetary rights over us humans, but it is also about our obligation towards this planet and one another by extension. So we're delighted to be able to have Simone Senogles enlighten us about her work and where she sees all those intersections and how she, through her organization and her commitment, serve in this space. Simone, please.
Yes. Thank you so much. So first I want to express my appreciation for being invited to be part of this crucial conversation. I'm so grateful for it, and I'm so grateful to get to know all of you, and I hope that we can learn more about each other going forward. Reverend Dionne, we're actually going to be, I think, in your church for a Indigenous Women's panel for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues next month. So hopefully we'll get to meet in person. I'll come and find you if I can. So yes, I'm just so grateful to be here and be able to share a little bit about what I know, having worked for the Indigenous Environmental Network for the last 25 years or so in various capacities. And so now one of my main focuses is to co-lead our Indigenous Feminisms program. So if it's okay, I'm going to first introduce myself in my language, and then I'll explain why as soon as I'm done. So Buju Chinodanikwe and Jijinikas and Misquagami Vizaga Iganing and Donjiba, Migizi and Dudame and Niman Wendam, Jawabmin on Nogum. So my name so I'm from the Red Lake Nation, so I'm calling from my homelands here in northern Minnesota. We're Anishinaabe. I'm Anishinaabe Kwe, Anishinaabe woman. And my father's from Argentina, so I'm a mixed race girl from the top of the Americas to the bottom of the Americas. It's given me quite an interesting perspective on life. I'm from the Eagle clan, and I'm, let's see, I'm sorry. And my name in Ojibwe, it means sort of like big storm woman. So quiet until until we have to be, right? It's like so many of us. It's a powerful name. I try my best to live it. But I wanted to share that the reason why we are taught as Indigenous people to introduce ourselves in that way with our clan, with our family, with our nation is because we always have to remember who we are in relation to our community, to our lands, our homelands, to our family, and to Mother Earth, Mama Aki. And so it grounds us in who we are, and then it informs all of our action after that. It keeps us accountable to our community. It keeps us accountable to our original instructions. And so I'm going to also honor the storytelling way of Indigenous peoples. And the stories that I'm going to be sharing are about myself, but they are not unique to me, and I am not alone. But they're a method of conveying information. And again, speaking from my own experience is my idea of being respectful. So when we were beginning, Allison spoke about the circle of women who protected some people who were fleeing. And I was thinking about that and the importance of the circle in Indigenous worldview, which is not, so life forms, humans, animals, plants, even rocks and water, all exist on a circle. So it's non-hierarchical. We are all part of creation. We are all part of each other. So even sometimes when people say that Indigenous peoples steward Mother Earth, yes and, right? So it's hard to steward because steward sometimes means other than instead of the same as, right? So there's those nuances that are part of our worldview that needs to be uplifted in these conversations around environmental justice, around the role and importance of women and girls, also Two-Spirit. And I also want to acknowledge that when Allison spoke about the Lenape people and the forced violent removal, that's also part of the foundation of what I'll be speaking about today, and the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Mother Earth. Right, so we are part of Mother Earth. We've been forcibly removed. We have a worldview that clashes with the current worldview that is in power, that is about domination. So if you think of the circle for us, maybe a pyramid. Nothing against the pyramid holders, but as far as hierarchical power, where it exists, right? So humans are at the top, and some humans are at the top, and then others, including animals, are at the bottom. But in the circle is what we're talking about today. So those circles are so important in so many ways. We even consider time in a circle and in a spiral, as opposed to a timeline. And I'm spending a little bit of time on this because it's about the situation that we find ourselves in as Indigenous women right now is nothing short of fundamental clash in worldviews and cosmovisions. So our cosmovision, and we are up against the cosmovision that is antithetical to Indigenous thought. And so I want to tell a story very quickly, and I don't want to take up too much time because I know I want to give time to Grove as well. But my great grandmother died in childbirth, and she experienced racism and violence from the medical community because she was, they didn't take proper care of her. And so all of her children were then taken from her husband and put into Catholic boarding schools where they suffered horrific abuse. And a lot of the purpose of that abuse was to separate them from that worldview we were talking about, to separate them from who they are, their culture, their own religion, their own way of thinking and seeing things, again, which is that we are part of Mother Earth. We are part of the environment. We are part of that, and we don't get to stand above anything else, right? Which is a very different world, which is why this place was so beautiful pre-contact. And so our original instructions as Indigenous women, as at least in my tribe, which is Anishinaabe, our original instructions from the Creator, from Gitchimanidu, is one of them is that women care for the water. And so recently there was an oil pipeline going through our community called Line 3. And many of us fought it. it was going through Anishinaabe territories, and the fiercest land defenders, the fiercest water defenders were Indigenous women. We were there exercising our leadership. In our language, Ogimakwewiwin, like the leadership of women. And when we were not allowed to exercise our original instruction, for example, I was protesting the pipeline going under the Mississippi River. And where we live, the Mississippi River, it's a huge river in the US. It's the beginning. She's just the baby Mississippi River here. It's clean. You can swim in her. She's beautiful. When we were trying to do our duty as Anishinaabe Kwe and protect the water, we were prevented from doing that, and we were jailed. And I was jailed. I experienced political violence while I was trying to do my duty to protect Mother Earth as Anishinaabe Kwe. I was wrestled to the ground by two large men. I'm not that big. I wasn't even resisting. And then I and 22 other women were put into one cell that was not meant for that many of us. And there was women who were 78 all the way down to 18. And we were jailed for trying to do our duty, for trying to live as Anishinaabe women. And that is violence. Climate change is violence against Indigenous women. Another thing about our, I'll just say this quick. I know I'm digressing. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock here. So in our way, we call them the moon grandmother, so Nokomis, and she controls all the water. And then we call the earth Mama Aki, A-K-I, Mother Earth. And so again, it's all about our relationship, our responsibility. And so another very big, and so, sorry, I have so many notes, y'all. I'm just like, I'm trying to like also just come from the heart and say as much as I can because I feel responsibility to bring this conversation to you all and to share it and to learn from you as well. But extractivism, patriarchy, capitalism, all of those are foundational pieces of the state that we're living in, the rise of authoritarianism, the decline of democracy. All of those things are dependent upon the oppression of Mother Earth and of Indigenous peoples. We are in the way. We are in the way, and we will continue to be in the way. And so there's this pandemic called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And there is, I was listening to some of the stats that Lopa was sharing earlier, and I wanted to share just a couple of my own. So some Indigenous women in the US experience murder rates that are 10 times higher than the national average. And murder is the third leading cause of death for Native women. And actually, in our situation, we experience the majority of our violence from outside our own communities and so the perpetrators are often non-Native. And again, this is like, we have to ask ourselves, why are we as Indigenous women targeted? And they say that no nation is conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. And so we understand that in order for the status quo to continue, in order for unchecked industrial growth, in order for the rise of authoritarianism, in order for the decline of democracy, in order for the continued environmental destruction and rampant extractivism to happen, Indigenous women must be conquered, must be oppressed. And that is what we understand as the root of the violence against Indigenous women. And that's why whenever we fight violence against Indigenous women, we do it systemically in that way. We definitely recognize that it comes down and it often shows itself in personal acts of violence, but the root of it is in colonialism. The root of it is in imperialism. The root of it is in capitalism. And the disposition of a foreign worldview that is not in keeping with what we are supposed to be doing, what we have been put here to do, which is to care for one another and to care for Mother Earth. Should I stop now? Because we only have 10 minutes left.
You know, my heart says don't stop. The fact that we do want to hear from each other would say, do you want to maybe just say a couple of roundup things before we?
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead then.
Okay, so I think, so what I'm trying to say is, call me if you want to talk more about this. I'm at the Indigenous Environmental Network. And I also want to mention that our religion, our freedom to practice our religions was illegal until 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And I was alive at that time. I remember going to sundances out in South Dakota, and there were armed young Native men guarding so that we could go and pray, so that we were safe to pray. But we had to go through that checkpoint to get to where we would be so that we would be safe. So it's you know, it's not all in the past. I think the way forward that I would like to share is the reclamation of the existing solidarity. I was talking to my mom once recently, one of the most brilliant thinkers I've ever met. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go to Guatemala and Brazil to build solidarity with my Indigenous brothers and sisters. They're my Indigenous sisters. And my mom was like, no, no, no. The solidarity exists already. What you need to do is recognize it. And so I've been thinking about that, that solidarity. So I think that's recognizing that solidarity is one of the answers. Rejecting the commodification of the sacred, from the Mother Earth to our bodies. We say what happens to the land happens to the body. And so as we heal ourselves, we heal Mother Earth. Mother Earth needs us just as much in right relationship as we need her. I think allowing dignified struggle. Right now, you know, the freedom of protest and dissent is under attack, and we must be able to have dignified struggle without fear of violence, incarceration, and death. I think also, although I'm not as familiar with some of the details, but the Beijing Declaration and Action Plan, FPIC, Free, Prior, and Informed Consent, and the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples with an S, are tools that have been provided through the efforts and years of work by many, many people. And those tools are available to the member states of the United Nations, and they need to go ahead and take up their responsibility and their obligation to utilize those tools and implement them and find strategies to put them in practice on the ground. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much, Simone. I think you have brought incredible light to the space and made the connection so effortlessly and flawlessly between the sacredness of this land and the human endeavor to protect it. Your wisdom is particularly valid and relevant and necessary now as we confront a situation that our previous speakers have highlighted in so many amazing ways, which is one where lawlessness and the lack of respect and utter undignification of our struggles seems to be the norm. So thank you for bringing that, all those places of light into our lives, and for reminding us that ultimately it is Native wisdom that made all of where we live today and stand and talk and breathe and eat possible, and that we need to honor it and honor the people who uphold it in order to actually try to deal with some of the very amazing karma that this nation we stand on together has accrued over the years. We need to stand, as you said, we need to strengthen the solidarity that already is there. Thank you for that. This brings me to, I think we've changed slightly. We're not going to have a second round. So I invite my beloved colleague, Grove Harris, to speak her truth and her wisdom. She is someone whom I continue to learn from as an eco-justice feminist. She's been absolutely amazing for me. It's every time she speaks, I learn something new, and I'm deeply grateful to her, because if it had not been for her, we wouldn't have been able to come together today. She's a co-founding executive partner of Lead Integrity. She's also the person working tirelessly to advocate for the Temple of Understanding within the United Nations. And she is someone who like each and every one of you, believes that it is not good enough to simply speak about the things that need to happen, but she's someone who will pay the price for doing what needs to happen to be in solidarity with planet and people alike. So, Grove Harris, thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for making this convening possible. And we now want to listen to your wisdom, please.
Thank you so much, Azza, for those kind words. And I'm so grateful to have had a chance to listen to everyone on this panel. This kind of coming together is all the more important given what we're facing in terms of the authoritarian takeovers. And I want to call out the lying. I think that part of our work, my work, is decolonizing what goes on in my head and to try and really be able to see clearly that any leader who is promoting drill baby drill is lying about what's going on this planet, and they're lying about climate change, and they're lying about their concept of their own power over having any sustainability beyond the next generation or two. And they are really exhibiting extremely selfish interest in consolidating power. And so there's power over, and that kind of requires some people to be power under. And those two choices don't work. So we have to, in my opinion, go to power with, and that's part of this whole circle. And I think all of us know power from within. So where am I understanding my own belonging to the world, to the earth, to the waters, to the trees, to the stones, to the compost? Because part of my commitment has been to see the full cycle and not look away from death and regeneration, and to understand that there is no, I hope it's become a cliche at this point, there is no throw it away. There is no away. There is right here, there's us, and there's respect. So, and also, if people do have a quick question, you can throw it into the Q&A. The chat was not open for me to see visibly, but please follow up. And I appreciate, Simone, I'll be happy to speak with you further and listen to you further. And same thing for myself. If people want to be in touch, we can then work on what are the dialogues that we need to see moving forward. The Temple of Understanding has been trying to work having dialogues that bring together diverse, non-always intrinsic conversation partners, because I think we know we need science. We need truth telling. We need all the different religious traditions, partly because that othering without a sense of curiosity is really part of the removal of dignity and allows for this perpetuation of the incredible violence against people and planet. And I do just want to mention the concept of trauma, because I am personally impacted by what I read and understand is happening around the planet. And it's unmanageable because of its scale, and whether it's another climate catastrophe forcing hundreds of thousands of people to relocate, and a country like Malawi, which is suffering both flooding and drought, and the kind of violence that's being perpetrated in Gaza, it is so painful and traumatic and numbing to just, it's like so powerful and relentless. And I just feel that we need to bring that kind of embodied presence of experience of the grief and the identification and the intersectionality of my life with the lives of others on the planet into our consciousness, especially for those of us privileged to enjoy policy discussions that don't always stay grounded in those kinds of lived realities. I don't think we can avoid being impacted, but we could choose to deny it, but that is going down the wrong path. I think the grief then is important. And I heard from a Buddhist teacher the other day, they said the thing is, we need to be able to feel grief, but not be grief. And so this idea, I believe it was Audrey who spoke of emotional intelligence, that I need to be able to participate in the flow of life by experiencing a feeling when I read about the pain and suffering of a fellow human. And I know there's many who feel the suffering of animals really intensely and therefore choose vegetarianism. And I know there's a million reasons to choose vegetarianism, and my choices matter. Azza, you brought up the personal is political. It indeed is. And it does not mean that my individual choices intrinsically add up, but that they are important for my walking the path of further awakening to next right action and living into solutions, which include things at this moment in time, like going back to glass bottles. Because if you haven't read about the tsunami of plastic pollution that is impacting all of our healths, it's amazing. And these are all implicated then to gender-based violence, because somehow women get to be the quintessential other. And somehow we are in some ways required to become trophies or to lie down in that dominator kind of model. So I want to leave a minute for Azza, you to say something brilliant to us wrapping up, but I am just honored to be part of this. And also to Simone, I just want to say that the freedom work that the Permanent Forum has indeed provided tools that are applicable in so many other circumstances. And representing the Temple of Understanding, I fought for the human right to water. And part of our work on that was using a litmus test about harm that was based on the work towards justice that was laid out in the Permanent Forum, and then sharing that to communities to say, yes, you deserve prior informed consent, and do no harm is a principle, and that we have to be able to stand on those principles as we speak out in whatever centered voice against the fullness of the onslaught that we're seeing, knowing that that onslaught is also lying. It is so that fundamentally life prevails, even when people are trying to squash it down and pave it over and tell us, if you only are a winner with $1 bazillion, you will have a good life. I rest assured that that pavement will crack and green life will come up, and my job is to fertilize that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and looking forward to networking and working closely together moving forward.
Thank you.
Azza?
Yes.
Azza?
Yes.
This is Suzanne. We have a question from the audience that is ironically a great question to end on. Would you like to hear it?
Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead, Suzanne.
How can we stay aware and empathetic to the global circumstances while also staying present and engaged in our local communities? It often feels like many of these things are out of our control, and the younger generations are experiencing compassion fatigue, anxiety, and depression. With so much bad going on, how can we reconnect to the world that in front of us?
What a brilliant question. You're right, Suzanne. Thank you for bringing that to our attention and reading it so beautifully. Maybe if you allow me, can I ask each of our speakers to just say one sentence, please, what you think would be the answer or potentially the answer to this brilliant question. Maybe I start this time. I just reverse the orders since you spoke last. Please, Grove, you speak first. What's your answer to that question? One sentence.
Practice of gratitude, to absolutely enjoy the fact of drawing breath in the morning, the fact of a warm blanket, the fact of the ability to share breakfast with some colleagues, and community as a key tool to be engaging. For myself, it's my town council meetings too. It is locally grounded action as well as the other.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Grove. Simone?
Help someone else, and exercise.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Reverend Dionne?
Simone, you said that we were in the way. I would say, stay in the way. Stay in the way. Also tap into ancestral wisdom, and make sure to use rest as resistance to the culture of um, evil that is trying to take us out, and love yourself and one another.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Reverend Dionne. I like the idea that you can persevere and rest, and in so doing, also love one another. Thank you. Audrey, please.
Thank you so much for this question. I want to ratify what Grove said about gratitude, because gratitude is so important. And also love that Reverend Dionne shared. We must also have the resilience that every moment that we live, we must be able to practice that love in action, in every loving thought, loving word, and act. Mother Teresa said, there's only one true religion, and that is kindness.
Mm.
And may we, every moment that we have, you see that as an opportunity to be kind.
Wow, thank you very much indeed. There is, to me, a great amount of echo of beauty and light and wisdom in all that you have shared, individually and together. Sometimes it takes a remarkable act of kindness to step aside when we see someone else amongst us who's more able to do something. We don't only have to always stand in the way. Sometimes we also have to cede ground to those who are perhaps possessed with something that we do not necessarily have, even though we give the good fight. But sometimes it takes an incredible amount of courage to cede the ground to those who may be younger or maybe older, somehow more wise, somehow more competent, somehow more loving, somehow more careful, somehow more strategic and determined. It takes courage to cede the ground as well as to stand firm. It takes love to be able to sometimes take over whatever crown we think we wear and put it on the heads of others as we stand in service to them, even though we feel we are owed that. Sometimes it takes a remarkable act of grace to love those who seem to be determined to be in opposition, to hate us, to torment us, to traumatize us. It takes a remarkable act of courage to stand in loving wisdom and witness and hold each other's hands. Our challenge today is that we're always looking for those who look like us, talk like us, think like us, and behave like us. And the truth is that it is only when we stand alongside those who may not at all be like us, but nevertheless figure out how to stand alongside in solidarity, that's when we can tip the balance, tip the scales, and get change. And guess what? We might learn a thing or two ourselves. Let us never be arrogant and sure of what we know. Let us always question that which seems so unquestionable. Let us always stand in humility against sometimes what we ourselves believe is the penultimate truth. It is in that space of being open to others' perspectives, especially when they are not at all like ours. They are not at all what we believe. Sometimes to stand in humility alongside and listen, we realize that we may be able to love even deeper. And this business of loving ourselves, it applies especially when we love one another. In my tradition, in Islam, we are told very clearly, If the Almighty, the Creator, the Divine, whatever we wish to call him, had willed it, we would all have been created alike. But the very fact that we have not been created alike, it is because we must get to learn one another. We must get to serve one another, the same verb. And in order to do so, we get to know more about ourselves. There is nothing more empowering than serving others and learning to love that other, precisely because that other is an other, which may include a blade of grass or a tree or some sand. It does not matter as long as it's the other, but it is in learning to love the other that we stand in strongest solidarity with one another. Thank you each and all, and I bid you a very, very enriching, empowering, provocative, but also beautifully peaceful time to stand in solidarity with one another and to continue, thank you, Simone, to continue to celebrate the solidarity that we have already, for we often forget and think we must build anew. Thank you very much indeed to each and all of you. I want to thank especially Alison for allowing us to partner with the Temple of Understanding, and Grove for opening her heart and her time in difficult moments to allow us to come together in this space. May the wisdom spread, may we continue to learn, and may the peace of the divine always be within you and amongst you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.